Hey guys, welcome back. I have another video for you today. It has to do with endgames as well, and particularly king and pawn endgames. So I think this is a very useful topic to discuss because it happens fairly frequently in chess games where you might find yourself up a pawn or down a pawn at the end of the game. And it can be a pretty easy position to blunder in. If you're up the pawn, blundering the win, and if you're down the pawn, you might be presented some opportunities to actually draw the game and miss them. So hopefully at the end of this video, you'll have a better understanding of the basics of king and pawn endgames. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but the basics are very useful. And at the end of the video, I have a nice puzzle for you guys. So before we get started, please remember to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the videos, and hit the bell to receive notifications when I upload new videos. So, king and pawn endgames. We're white here, and you can see we are up a pawn. So first question, are we winning? Is white winning in this game? Or is this game a draw? And if you're not sure, definitely be sure to stick around because hopefully you'll be able to answer that question at the end of this video. So the right answer is actually, it's a trick question, which I like to do a lot in my videos. The correct answer is it totally depends on whose turn it is. So, and it's even trickier than that. If it's white's turn, this should be a draw. And if it's black's turn, then this should be a win for white. And the reason for that is because of a term that's known as opposition. And opposition is a complicated term, probably, but it means something fairly simple. What it means here is you can see these two kings are facing each other, and they cannot get any closer to each other than where they already are. So whoever's turn it is has to give ground to the opponent's king. And that's the important part here. So if we're thinking about really what we want to do as white, up a pawn, obviously what we want to do is promote this pawn all the way, march him all the way to d8 and promote him into a queen. If we can promote him to a queen, we should be able to win the game. In order to do that, we need to move our king forward. Rule number one, if you're up the pawn, you always want your king in front of the pawn, okay? And the main goal for white in this example is to get their king onto e7 or c7. If we can get our king, let's do the fancy blue arrows. If we can get our king to either one of these two squares while protecting our pawn the whole time, then what we're doing is we are protecting these three squares and protecting the promotion square for our own pawn by the same principles of opposition that I went through 1 minute ago. So that's where we want to get. We want to get our king to here or here, okay? And that's baked into that whole idea is whose turn is it, and can white actually push his king forward without meeting resistance? So what we're going to do is I'm going to go through two examples. One, black's moving first, and the other example, white's moving first, and we will see how those games go. So first game, black moves first. White should be able to win here. So again, black can't move any of these squares and he has to give some ground. So let's say, in a simple example, black moves backwards. Probably wouldn't do that in reality. But if he does, we move our king forward. And we can continue to move our king forward. The important part is moving the king forward while always protecting our pawn, making sure this king can't somehow sneak around and win our pawn from under our noses. But there is an important thing here. So let's say black moves to c7. We always want to keep opposition. What that means is do not play d4. Because if we play d4, black can play d7. And now we're in the same position we were in before, but now it's our turn to move. And we don't want that, okay? So don't play d4 here. Instead, what we can do is play e6. And that's the general idea if black is trying to sidestep us, is we're still gaining ground, but we're gaining it in the direction opposed to wherever black went, or white if black is up a pawn. So we move to e6, and now let's say our opponent's trying to go capture our pawn. He can't do that. Our pawn's covering this square, king's covering all these squares. so we actually can't make it. So he's going to go back to c7. We're going to push our pawn again, and a critical moment here, and also another moment that's similar. The kings are lined up with each other, but notice it's black's turn again, and he can't move to any of these 3 squares. So black, let's say he moves here, we're going to move our king to the promised land, which is e7 or c7, like I said, and now our pawn promotion is guaranteed. There's nothing black can do about it. Black can try all he wants, but there's nothing he can do to stop this promotion from occurring. And I'm going to go back, and we're going to talk about, instead of going straight backwards, let's say black goes here instead. Okay, not there, sorry, here. That would make more sense. Again, we're going to try to gain ground with our king in the opposite direction of wherever black went. And notice if black goes here, he cannot capture the pawn. So we can just push our pawn. Okay, and now we're keeping opposition in this direction. Okay, so let's say black goes back here. We can push the pawn, and we're maintaining the opposition at all times. Let's say black goes to this side now. Now we're going to go here, moving forward, allowing an avenue for our pawn to move across the board. Okay, so we're going to continue doing this. And at this point, it's exactly the same as the way I had shown you before. We go to e7, and there's just nothing that black can do to prevent us from pushing the pawn. So again, always keep the king in front of the pawn, and we want to get the king to these 2 squares while protecting our pawn. Okay? Now let's see what happens when white moves first. So if white goes to either this square or this square, that would be pretty weird, but we would just go to e4 and basically keep the opposition here. So likely what white will do is go to e3 or c3. So what black wants to do here is prevent the king, white's king, from moving forward. So what we do is we always keep this opposition. If white goes to c3, we're going to move here. And we can dance all we want, but white is not going to be able to push his king any further forward here. Okay, so what white's going to realize after a little while is that he's gaining no ground here, so he's going to push his pawn. Whenever white pushes the pawn, we move our king directly in front of the pawn. And now, I mean, if he moves backwards, we just move our king backwards. Okay, but what white's going to realize again is that there's no progress to be made here unless he pushes the pawn again. And notice that his king is now actually behind the pawn. So this is when you know that this should be a drawn position. If he's in line with the pawn or behind his pawn, if you play your cards right, it's a draw as black. So when he pushes the pawn, we move directly backwards. And if he pushes the king here, we just step in front of the pawn. So now, the point is, once white decides to move his king forward, we're blocking him. We're not allowing him to move any further forward. And that's the general idea of this. So he's going to push the pawn again. We're going to go in front of the pawn. He can go here. We're going to block him again. We're not allowing the king to move forward. He pushes the pawn. We go back. And once he moves the king here, we're going to go straight backwards again. Always try to stay directly in front of this pawn. The only time you don't do that is when you're blocking your opponent's king from moving forward. And here we have this ending situation here where, again, white has to push the pawn. And when white pushes the pawn, what we want to do as black is block that. And now this game is just drawn because, let's say white moves anywhere over here, we just capture it. So white's only option, white cannot move here because of our king. So white's only option here to protect this pawn is to move to d6. And now this is a draw by stalemate because this pawn is attacking these 2 squares and our opponent's king is getting these 2 squares. We have nowhere to move. And that is how the basics of how you draw a game down a pawn here. Okay, so with white, we want to move our king as far forward as possible, and with black, we want to prevent the white king here from moving forward no matter what, essentially. So those are some of the basics, and there's a couple of, I guess, caveats here that we should talk about. The first caveat is rook pawns. You might think this is the same scenario as before if the pawn is on any other rank, but it's actually not the case. And the reason for that is illustrated easily by this very simple example. So we have two of the exact same scenarios here. One is with a b pawn, and one, which I'll show you in a minute, is with an a pawn. So it's white's turn to move here, and he's going to push his pawn to b7. Now notice black can't go here or here or here, so black only has one move to make. And black's going to go to a7. And notice that it's allowing white onto the vaunted c7 square so that he can finally promote this pawn and turn it into a queen and win the game. So that's how this scenario would go if you have a pawn on any of these files. Now what happens if we have a rook pawn? And by the way, a rook pawn means a pawn on the a file or the h file. The pawns that are in front of the rooks, they're wing pawns, you could also call them. Now notice when white pushes this pawn, the king, black king here, no longer has that other side of the board to get to. He's trapped in this corner. And just like before, these two squares are being attacked or are not allowed to be moved to by black. So this is a stalemate, and this will end in a draw. So what's important to note, I would say, is if you have a scenario where you can see that you might be up a pawn, if it's a rook pawn, you might want to think twice about allowing that to happen, because rook pawns typically end in draws. As long as your opponent can get his king in front of the pawn, this is a draw every single time. So a little difference there, which you should be aware of. And finally, this is very similar to the first example, except now we have a space in between our king and our pawn. We're white, thankfully. So let's think for a second. Is this any different than before? Does it depend on whose turn it is here to determine if white can actually win or not? And the answer is no, it doesn't matter. This should be a winning game for white either way. And the reason for that is, again, you have opposition. So if let's say white was back, well, no, let's not say that. What happens is, even if it's white's turn, you essentially have a free turn here. You have a skip. So if it's white's turn to move, instead of retreating the king backwards or sidestepping, all white has to do is move his pawn one move forward, one space forward, and now it's black's turn. And now we have the opposition. So if you can get your king up a pawn, like a space or two in front of that pawn, the game should be won with proper play, essentially. And I would say the general rule, just going back to these scenarios where you're directly in front of your pawn, if you can get your king in front of your own pawn on the 5th rank or lower, then it depends on opposition 100%. If it's your turn, the game should be a draw. However, if you can get your king in front of your pawn on the 6th rank or higher, then that game is won. You will be able to win the game. So that's kind of the dividing line, is the 5th rank. Okay? And that pretty much wraps up the basics video. If you guys have any questions about this, because it's a little bit of a confusing topic, please make sure to let me know in the comments. And now I promised you a puzzle. And here's the puzzle. So black here by the way, this was an actual game that happened in 1946 between two grandmasters. And it was pretty weird. So I will show you what happened here. So black is up 2 pawns. Each side has a rook, but black has 2 pawns. And they're also pretty far pushed forward already, which is even better for black. So this is just a winning game. However, black plays the move b2. It seems like a good idea, because what black is thinking is if white captures this pawn on b2, black hits the king with check, and once king gets out of the way, he wins the pawn. The rook, I'm sorry. So that was black's idea, which makes sense, but it actually doesn't quite work out the way he was hoping. So why don't you pause the video here for a couple seconds, or a couple minutes if you want, and try to figure out how white can save this game, okay? And if you can't figure it out, in a couple seconds, I'm going to give you guys a hint that might help you. So pause the video, think about it. Okay, so if you haven't figured it out yet, the key to this puzzle is not actually winning the game for white. The key is white can actually force a draw. And yes, force it. Let's just say, I will even give you more of a hint. Force it by stalemate. So see if you can figure out how white can force a draw here. And I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, so white's correct move is actually capturing the pawn. And congratulations if you found this, because it's a little tricky. So the key is, when black hits our king with check, we have to move our king to f3. And then after black captures that rook, this game ends in a stalemate. These two squares are protected by black's king. These two squares are taken up by black's pawn. And of course, this entire row here is covered by black's rook. So this is a draw for white. And this is what that guy found in 1946 to draw the game. So I thought that was a pretty interesting move. And it's another great example that even grandmasters make mistakes in chess. So don't feel down when you make mistakes and make errors. It's all part of the game. So that pretty much wraps up this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.